Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Next week, we've got a federal election. It's probably an important federal election, as it turns out, as to how Canada is going to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, how we're going to invest in coming back. About a week ago or so, I read an article in the Globe and Mail, and Professor Beland was quoted quite extensively in regards to his attitudes towards what we need to do in Canada and what we're not addressing in the federal election. And I reached out to him, and he's agreed to join us and chat today with us. Daniel Beland is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada and a professor of political science at McGill. He's known for his research about fiscal and social policy in Canada and elsewhere around the world. Today, we're going to talk about COVID-19. We're going to talk about longer-term impacts of crises, both COVID-19 and some other ones. And we're going to talk about the role of government in fiscal policy in Canada and how it should change. Professor Daniel Beland, thank you for joining us. How are you, sir?
I'm fine. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. So your article, or the article that quoted you, was pretty negative in regards to that the federal election currently wasn't addressing the issues that are most important facing Canada today. Do you agree? Are there issues that we need to be addressing and talking about in this election that we're not really focused on?
Well, I think that there are a lot of issues we are talking about during this campaign, but it's true that I think that the future of spending in this country, the fiscal future of the country is a really crucial issue that is probably not discussed as much as we should. But it's a campaign, so there are all sorts of things that are happening that may move the debate in a different direction than we expected. We thought there would be a lot of discussion about COVID, and yes, we have been talking a lot about COVID, but especially about anti-vaxxers and about vaccine mandates and so forth. But I think that we are not talking enough about the long-term future of the country in relationship to fiscal issues and public policy more generally.
What do you mean? So the Conservatives have said that they're going to balance the budget within 10 years. Are you suggesting that we need to have someone focused on balancing the budget more quickly?
It's not necessarily about balancing the budget more quickly. It's having a real conversation about the trade-offs that are at stake. I don't think that you can just justify or pay for all this new funding, the new spending, and the spending, really, the Conservatives, the NDP, of course, the Liberals, they are putting forward very ambitious platforms with dozens of billions of dollars in extra spending over the next 5 years or 10 years. And we are not having a conversation about trade-offs and about taxation. Like the NDP is saying, yeah, we have to tax the rich, but it's not enough.
The super rich. The super rich, yeah, $10 million a year and more in corporations. But this is obviously not enough to fund all their pledges, their platform planks. So, and even for the Liberals or the Conservatives, I think that it's something that we always struggle with in this country, because the T word, tax or taxation, is kind of dirty, and we don't want to talk about it during a campaign, except when it's only about the super rich or the other, quote unquote. And you can talk about it.
Yes, but I do think that this is something that we should address. It's not that higher taxes are necessarily a bad thing, but we need to have an adult conversation about the trade-offs involved in higher spending, which means that they necessarily lead in the long run to a higher tax burden. The question is who will pay and how, and it will not just be the super rich if we keep spending as much as we do now, or even if we slow the spending beyond the pandemic, but we don't return to the level that it was before the pandemic, unless economic growth is really sustained for a very long period of time at a high level. We'll need to ask the tough questions about taxation.
And it seems like we actually have a risk of stagflation, that we're getting inflation, but the economy doesn't appear to be growing nearly as quickly as some people had suggested. We're not getting that V-shaped recovery or hockey-shaped recovery that some people were hoping.
Absolutely. So we'll have to, of course, wait and see, because the thing with these with COVID-19 and other crises we've seen before is that their duration is very important. Their intensity is important. And I think that as long as, so if the economic recovery, a sustainable economic recovery doesn't come fast enough, it's likely that we'll probably spend even more. It's an old Keynesian tool, right? Deficit spending. When the economy is not doing well, you enact what we call counter-cyclical policies, which is what we have done since the beginning of the crisis. And frankly, we needed to spend a lot last spring because otherwise the economy could have collapsed altogether. So it was a good move. But now we have to ask this question: where are we going? In the long run? But it's a bit hard to fully answer this question. Because of in this context where there is still a lot of uncertainty about, whether we are really out of the woods or not in terms of COVID.
It's interesting. I think when you say what are we going to spend, where we're going in the long term, we've got the Conservatives that are talking about a 6% increase in healthcare transfers to the province without a lot of conditions, and it's a fairly significant increase in healthcare spending. We got the Liberals with their very extensive childcare program. We have the NDP with this program in regards to pharmacare, national pharmacare, and then the Greens talking about guaranteed annual income. So each one of them have their own very sizable social program. And it's interesting to compare it to Biden, President Biden in the United States, who's got this, I can't remember what it is, $3 trillion or something like that, infrastructure spending. So he's spending it on what I would have thought as actually things that are far more critical for productivity and efficiency in the economy longer term. Anyway, we're going to take a break and come back in just a minute with Daniel Beland, professor from McGill, in a minute to talk a little bit more about what we're going to do to come out of COVID-19 and the long-term fiscal and social policies in Canada. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about the future of Canada, the fiscal and social policy future of Canada, in a far more, I think, longer-term basis than we have been during the election campaign, with Professor Daniel Beland, who is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada and the James McGill Professor, Department of Political Science at McGill University. I heard him quoted, I read him quoted in a really interesting article in the Globe and Mail, and he was really quite profound in his long-term implications for Canada. Professor Beland is a student of politics and public policy, is currently working on research projects focused on issues ranging from universal social policy and healthcare reform to the role of ideas in policy development and the relationship between fiscal policy and the welfare state development. I love that, the role of ideas. I want to probe you a little bit more on that, sir, in a while. Professor Beland has published 20 books and more than 160 articles in peer-reviewed journals. Recent books include How Ideas and Institutions Shape the Politics of Public Policy, the University and Social Policy in Canada, co-edited with others, Fiscal Federalism and Equalization Policy in Canada, and it goes on, the list goes on and on. Professor Beland holds a PhD in political sociology from the École de Haute, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, I apologize. How do I pronounce this university?
École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales.
In Paris, where he returned as a visiting scholar in the spring of 2014. He's a part-time professor. He was a part-time professor at the University of Southern Denmark from 2014 to 2017, and has been a visiting scholar at Harvard University and the National University of Singapore, a visiting professor at the University of Bremen, the University of Helsinki, the University of Southern Denmark, a Fulbright scholar at the George Washington University, and the National Academy of Social Insurance before joining McGill University in 2019. What an incredible resume that you've got, sir. And you've been around the world, Singapore, Denmark, Paris, incredible international experience. In addition to his academic work, Professor Beland has participated in numerous training sessions for civil servants, provided policy advice in federal and provincial officials, and testified in front of the Saskatchewan Federal Electoral Boundaries Commission, Standing Senate Committee on National Finance, and Standing Committee on Finance in the House of Commons. He's frequently asked to comment on key policy and political issues, as I have done today. Professor Beland, thank you again for joining us and honoring us with such an incredible background and knowledge. And where do you get time to write 20 books and 160 articles? Like, my gosh, that's unbelievable.
Well, I have collaborators, so a lot of this is done with in collaboration with other people. I have to say too that before coming to McGill, I was at the University of Saskatchewan, and before that, I was at the University of Calgary. So I've spent quite a bit of time out west, internationally, of course, as also, but outside of Quebec and in other parts of the country, and I'm really happy to be the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, because we have big challenges ahead of us. And it's good to be talking to people all across the country about these challenges, and also look abroad to see whether we cannot learn from other countries about how to address these challenges.
You know, it's interesting that you got this experience in Saskatchewan and Alberta and are now back in Montreal. Maybe let's go off topic just for a second and I ask you a question about separatism. You know, I talked to a political person just the other day who told me that the Maverick Party is doing quite well. And the Maverick Party is effectively the Wexit Party. And a gentleman by the name of, I think it's Jay Hill, that used to be a conservative reform person that's leading that, and really is following the Bloc Québécois strategy and arguing that that worked for Quebec. And he wants it to work for Alberta and Saskatchewan. And then I spoke, the same individual said that they were surprised that there was one poll that showed that Maxime Bernier and I can't remember, what is it, the People's Party of Canada, was at 10%. And it's primarily because of the anti-vax attitudes. And I guess the question is, in a time when we need to come together to talk about these long-term issues, are we fragmenting instead?
Well, I think we'll have to wait on September 20th or 21st, early in the morning.
Or 25th.
Yeah, or 25th, when we get the actual results of the election. If we talk about the People's Party, they are obviously, like the Green Party, the smaller parties, disadvantaged by our electoral system, by first past the post system. So I'm not sure how many seats they could get, even at 10% of popular vote. But certainly if they get at least one seat, they will be, and perhaps that's Maxime Bernier in both, maybe someone else, maybe more than one. Then that will, I think, change the dynamics for that party, because they will have representation in the House of Commons. As for the Maverick Party, they are running in ridings where conservatives are almost certain to win. They're not running in some, for example, Edmonton and Calgary ridings where the Liberals or the NDP could win. So they are not a real threat to the conservatives. But I would say that the Brexit movement and now the Maverick Party, they are exerting pressure on, of course, Jason Kenney at the provincial level in Alberta, but things are not doing well for Jason Kenney. But there is a referendum on equalization. You mentioned equalization earlier, a referendum on equalization in Alberta on October 18. And we'll see whether Jason Kenney wins this referendum, which is about removing equalization from the Constitution, which, of course, Alberta cannot do unilaterally, but putting the pressure on the federal government to act on equalization, because there's the sense that it's unfair to Albertans. And so this has implications for national unity, that's for sure. But right now, oil prices are higher. The economy, that might help the economy out west. I think part of the resentment that we see in Alberta or Saskatchewan is related to the economic downturn, really, that started in 2014 with the sudden fall of oil prices, and also the presence of a Trudeau government in Ottawa. So if the Conservatives will form government, I think a lot of this, like the push for Brexit and so forth, might decline quite suddenly. But if the Liberals stay in power, and also if the economic conditions don't improve in a durable, sustainable way in provinces like Alberta, I think this movement is unlikely to collapse or fall in a sudden way.
You know, it's interesting because just yesterday there was a fascinating review that compared what Aaron O'Toole is doing with Conservative Party policies to David Cameron in the UK, and suggested that he was really trying to modernize it and move it more socially progressive to the center, if not, frankly, to the left of where a lot of historically conservative politicians, particularly in Western Canada, have been. And they suggested, I guess, comparable to you, that if Aaron O'Toole is successful, that he will change the Conservative Party and make it a more centrist party, a more progressive Conservative Party. But if he's not, then there is a lot of pressure with the Wexit, with the Maverick, with the People's Party of Canada, etc., and that the Conservative Party may regress and go back to being a more Reform Alliance conservative party. What do you think of that?
Yes, I think what's happening now, we saw that earlier this year, there were some tensions within the Conservative Party of Canada. We saw that their Congress, when there was this vote on climate change as an important human-made threat, and only, I think, 44% of members voted in favor of it. That was a slap in the face of Erin O'Toole, really. And there were also other, some bickering over abortion and so forth. I do think that if Erin O'Toole succeeds, and finds a way to form a minority government, for example, I think that he might, yes, transform the Conservative Party. But if he fails, you're right. I think that there are people out west, but elsewhere too, who are more to the right of Erin O'Toole that could be on family, religious values, because Erin O'Toole is pro-choice, but it can also be on economic and fiscal issues, on energy, that they will like to take the party over again, right? So I think that it's a crucial moment, not just for the country, what will happen on September 20th, but also it's a crucial moment for the Conservative Party of Canada. Will it be redefined in a more centrist party, or will it go back to its kind of Western roots? Because of course there was, yes, a merger between the Progressive Conservative Party and then the Canadian Alliance, and if there is a East-West tension within this party. It was only created in 2003. It's a young party, although Conservatives have existed since the Johnny MacDonald and the creation of our country. In 1867, the Conservative Party of Canada, the product of a merger between two parties, is only 18 years old. Yeah. So it's still I would say a late adolescent, a late teenager, or a young adult, and there are still tensions about its identity within it that are quite deep, I think.
You raised taxation and the need for us to think about taxation to pay back some of the costs at some point in time. I had an interesting conversation, probably not for public consumption, but at a wedding I ran into former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. And he said that he thought the smartest thing that he ever did was the GST, and that free trade was critically important, but that to put our fiscal situation in good balance, the GST was the most important policy they put in place. And he said he worried that in history, Stephen Harper's reduction of the GST by 2 points would end up going down as one of the worst political decisions and fiscal decisions ever made, because he thought that extra 2 points would end up being critical. Should we be considering increasing the GST again?
Yes. From a political standpoint, if I advise politicians right now in the campaign, I say, shut your mouth, don't talk about it, obviously, because politically it would be very damaging. And we saw how the GST was damaging to the Conservatives. Remember a few seats they got back in 1993. It was related to Charlottetown and Meach, the failure of these constitutional really talks. But also, I think the GST was something that many Canadians disliked, to say the least. I agree with Brian Mulroney about the fact that, and many economists agree with, and I'm not an economist, I'm a political scientist, but many economists agree with Brian Mulroney that this was a mistake from a policy standpoint. But politically, it helped the Stephen Harper and the Conservatives. The thing with the GST, the way, and if you compare to other countries, is that it's a highly visible tax, right? So when you pay, you go to and it's not the case in Europe. You have value-added taxes in France or Denmark or Germany, where you don't see it. You don't see it when you buy. It's included in the price already. But here in Canada, it's highly visible. You know how much GST or you pay and so forth, or provincial sales tax or harmonized sales tax you pay every time you purchase something. And the Conservatives did that back then under Mulroney, so that the cost the GST and the fiscal cost was visible to consumers, but that might have been a mistake in the sense that if you had adopted a kind of European model where the tax is included in the price already, it would not have been as visible. About taxes, there is this Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a former a justice in the US, a Supreme Court justice, and there is a famous quote from him, which is on the building of the IRS in Washington, D.C. And I spent time in Washington, D.C., as you said earlier, and I will walk in front of that building regularly. And on it, it's written, taxes are what we pay for civilized society. Taxes are what we pay for civilized society. So taxes are important, and new spending should normally, there is economic growth, of course, but when it exceeds what we expect economic growth might be, realistically, and realistically is a key word here, we should also plan to raise more money in a way that is fair. If you want a childcare system like in Sweden or Denmark, you might have to pay more taxes in the end. That's what we do in Quebec. Taxes in Quebec are higher than in any other province in this country, and among the highest in North America.
But as the conservatives have talked about, the conservatives talked about healthcare, and the liberals talked about childcare, and the NDP talked about pharmacare. Other than this comment about taxing the super rich, no one has talked about how they're going to pay for it.
Absolutely, and that's my criticism. At the same time, from a political standpoint, strategic standpoint, they are serving their short-term electoral interests. But what I'm saying is that in this country, people like us who are not running for seats and for power, we should tell people that a conversation about taxation is important, and it cannot just be about the super rich. It's about how we will contribute to public policy. We will fund these policies, but you cannot just talk about the cake without talking about its cost. And I do think that in the long run, we will have to pay more. So we may as well start a conversation early instead of having a bad surprise and then all us being upset because suddenly a government will introduce a tax that was not discussed or even alluded to during the previous campaign. That's what happened with the GST, right, with Mulroney. It was a bad surprise for many Canadians because we didn't have really a conversation about this. We don't want to have one. The same thing in the US. We talk about Joe Biden. In the US, it's always about just taxing the rich more and more, which is fine, but it's often not enough. And we see with the proposal of the NDP, the numbers just don't add up.
We're chatting tonight with Professor Daniel Beland, who is a professor at McGill University, a commentator who has written 20 books, over 200 articles, commenting about public policy. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Professor Beland in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting about really the federal election in a long-term perspective with Professor Daniel Beland, who is at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, the director of that institute at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. He has got really an incredible both domestic as well as international experience. He's been a professor in Saskatchewan and Calgary, in Europe, in Singapore, etc. So he's been around the world and across Canada. He's written 20 books, 160 articles in peer-reviewed journals, and he's commented on public policy. We have been chatting about taxation. Let me, sir, take you back to one of our first conversations, if I could, and compare what President Biden is doing with infrastructure spending in the United States versus the social policy, healthcare for the Conservatives, childcare for the Liberals, pharmacare for the NDP, guaranteed annual income for the Greens. The Biden proposal seems to be far more efficiency, productivity, economic growth oriented. And maybe you could argue that childcare has an economic growth aspect in regards to getting females back into the workforce. But we don't seem to be focused nearly as much on productivity and economic growth. Why is that? And is that a mistake, or is that just what Canada's all about? Social policy is more important.
Well, two things. The first thing is that childcare can be a tool of economic growth, and we saw that in Quebec. There are even economists who argue that the program pays for itself because it increases labor market participation of young parents, especially young women, which grows the economy. As for Biden, we have to be careful here just because they also, earlier this year, Congress adopted a massive stimulus package that features child benefits and other social programming that may actually reduce poverty in the US in a dramatic way. So Biden is doing both. He's spending a lot of money. I mean, not just Biden, but the federal government in the US, they are spending more on social policy, stimulus, and spending more on infrastructure. So the US, of course, it's easy for them to borrow money. And it seems that in the US too, they have the same problem as we have in Canada, which is, they don't like to talk about new taxes or taxation. And it's been the case for a long time. You remember George H.W. Bush's famous quote, "No, read my lips, no new taxes." That was back in 2088. Back in 1988. That was a long time ago. And he paid a price for this later because he had to raise taxes, and then people were not happy about it. So I think the US has a fiscal challenge too, but of course it's a bigger country. It's very easy for them to borrow, but it's a very interesting shift that we see in both countries actually. You remember in the 1990s, how balancing the budget was such a big issue. Of course, in Canada, we had the 1995 budget. In the US under Clinton, they actually balanced the federal budget, and they generated huge surpluses in Canada too. But it seems that something has changed in both countries. If you talk about Canada specifically, I think a big turning point was the 2015 electoral campaign. Tom Mulcair, the leader of the NDP, and at the time, people don't always remember, the NDP had a real shot at power. Yeah. He actually promised only something like $35 billion in new spending over 5 years, which is very, very small compared to what the NDP is pledging right now. And he said that balancing the budget will be a priority for him. It's something he will do in the short run. Justin Trudeau moved on the left of Tom Mulcair and said balancing the budget in the short run was not so important. And that helped him on the campaign trail. And since then, we've seen, of course, the idea of balancing the budget, something that we postpone. Now it's 10 years from now, perhaps, even for the Conservatives. So it's a really important change, and that's related, I think, to partisan competition, and the fact that and also the context of a minority government, where spending is really on the agenda, and balancing the budget is something that is pushed, to the future, relatively remote future. Now, the COVID crisis, I think it's normal to run big deficits when you have such a crisis, because you need to stimulate the economy to avoid a collapse, to avoid the collapse altogether. But then how do you move out of this crisis? And this is what the debate on the campaign trail is. But all the parties have the major parties have big spending agenda, as you mentioned earlier, but there is no real discussion about how we'll pay for it. And I think this is a conversation that we need to have. And if we don't have it during the campaign because politicians don't want to talk about things that might be unpopular, we need after September 20th to really discuss taxation, but also fiscal federalism. You mentioned healthcare funding. Earlier, I mentioned equalization. We need to rethink how we tax people and what we do with the money. And we cannot just create new spending programs without thinking about the taxation side of things.
Now, in the 1990s, you mentioned, the government went back into surplus. And really, that was fairly aggressive plans that Finance Minister Paul Martin and Prime Minister Jean Chrétien went under. We had what some people called the peso crisis in Canada after Mexico. The Canadian dollar was under attack and was being devalued, and it became the number one objective of the Canadian government at that time was to write our fiscal strategy. I also saw a really fascinating review of how we got out of World War II debt that was recently publicized. And it wasn't increase in taxes, it was decreased in expenditures, and a fairly dramatic, about a 15-year decreases in taxes. It took us until the 1970s to get back to public spending on a per capita basis comparable to what we had in World War II. So after World War II, we reduced spending. After the crisis, the peso crisis in the late 80s, early 1990s, we cut spending. don't you think we need to cut spending in the next couple of years?
Well, it will depend on economic growth, because you mentioned that after Second World War, what we had, we went through a Great Depression for almost a decade, right? The Great Depression was from 29 almost to the beginning of the Second World War. The Second World War helped our economy in a big way because of manufacturing. We had to build tanks and so forth. Unemployment collapsed, declined very, very rapidly. And after the war, we had an unprecedented era of economic growth, right? For 30 years in French, they use the expression 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, the golden years. So we had major economic prosperity up. Of course, there were fluctuations, but up to the 1973 oil crisis. But certainly, and that's not just Canada, that's the West.
The whole world, right?
Yeah. So we had, and so when the economy is doing so well, you don't need emergency programs anymore, and you can reduce spending, but reduction of spending as proportion of GDP is also related to economic growth. So I think it would be a mistake to go too fast here and to start cutting while we are not sure if the economic recovery is sustainable, because we could shoot ourselves in the foot. What I'm talking about is not what we'll do in 1 or 2 years, but over the next 5 or 10 years, and whether we need to have a conversation about taxation. But you cannot increase taxes when the economy is in a dire situation, or when the economy the economic recovery is really frail. You have to wait. But once the economy is doing better, you can adjust that. But don't forget too, taxes were increased dramatically during the Second World War. You look at the tax rates that we had in Canada in 1945, 1950, much, much higher than they are today. So they didn't need to raise taxes because they were already really high. But and so that's something that we have to keep in mind as well.
And far more progressive. And, I think the top rate was like 75% or something like that. And so therefore,
Absolutely.
maybe Jagmeet Singh's proposal of taxing the super rich is really the history of Canada. Let me ask you a question. I understand that you're really a student of crises and past crises. Again, coming back to President Biden, it's been often quoted that, he was in vice president during the recovery from the 2008, 2009 crisis. And his attitude this time was that they didn't spend enough coming out of the fiscal crisis at the global recession, the Great Recession back in 2009. What do you think? Did we not spend enough last time? And so therefore everyone wants to spend almost too much this time to ensure that we've got this V-shaped recovery?
Yeah, I think it's, there is something that political scientists call emergency Keynesianism. When Keynesianism is we talk about the role of ideas, right? It's an economic theory that, of course, became popular in the 1930s and 40s, became really dominant, and then it declined somewhat after the 1970s with monetarism and other economic theories that focus more on the role of markets to stimulate growth rather than the central role of the state in the economy, of government in the economy. But every time we have a crisis, we return to Keynesianism and the idea of priming the pump, the idea of deficit spending, the idea of, spend a lot now to avoid a collapse of the economy and to adopt what we call counter-cyclical measures. So we are all Keynesians during a crisis, it seems, or at least civil servants and many politicians are. Now, if you look at Canada in 2008, it was a minority conservative government, and I think Stephen Harper was quite reluctant to spend a lot, and he was under pressure from opposition parties. I remember Liberals, the Bloc, the NDP pushing him to spend more and more. This time around, last year, the Liberals didn't need that much push from the other parties to spend more, and I think that's a major change. That shows the role of ideas. The Liberals are much more receptive to Keynesianism and to the idea that during crisis you have to spend a lot of money. And I think things are changing in the US too. And we see that there is more eagerness to spend so much, maybe because the souvenir of 2008 is fresh to our mind as well. And it actually worked in a way. I mean, you look at, there was a huge financial crisis, there was a recession, but we came out of that recession. And it was not like the Great Depression in the 1930s. It was not that long, right? So I think
we have the example
of what happened then.
And we have the example of Japan, which didn't spend enough.
Yes.
And the well-spoken about L-shaped recovery that Japan has.
Absolutely. So we learn from other countries and from what we are doing as well. But sometimes we don't always draw the full lessons or the right lessons. So because each context is different, each situation is different. So sometimes we compare things, but they are not exactly the same. So we just have to be careful about that.
Well, it's interesting to use the Stephen Harper example of 2008, 2009. So let me come to it. And maybe this is short-term thinking, which is not what you're talking about. You're talking about long-term thinking. But we had a minority conservative government. The world had an economic collapse. The Conservatives came out with their initial, I can't remember whether it was a budget or fiscal update, but it wasn't nearly expansive enough. The Liberals and the NDP demanded that it become more extensive. Harper prorogued Parliament, and the Liberals and the NDP started talking about a coalition, even though that the Conservatives were had the plurality of votes at the time. And it was almost lucky, I think it was late January of 2009, when Michael Ignatieff, the then leader of the Liberal Party, announced that he would support the Conservatives. And that was really the end of Michael Ignatieff and the opportunity for coalition. But the interesting thing that came there is, I think Stephen Harper said, Conservatives will never work with the Bloc. And politically, if Aaron O'Toole has the plurality but in a minority, he will have to work with the Bloc or the NDP if he wants to get the votes. What do you think is going to happen if Aaron O'Toole has the plurality? Not a majority, but the plurality after September 20th.
Yes, we'll see. Right now, a conservative majority sounds really like a long shot. So I think that the odds are either a liberal, a minority, or perhaps a majority, but again, that's a long shot too on the other end of the spectrum. I think it would be it's much more difficult for in this context, current context, it would be much more difficult for the Conservatives to govern with a minority government than for the Liberals, because the Liberals have a lot in common with the NDP. In fact, they have stolen some of their policy ideas, or at least, emulated the NDP in many ways. And sometimes they can also rely on the Conservatives or other parties to get things done. For the Conservatives, it's a much more difficult task, especially because obviously ideologically they don't see eye to eye with the NDP. And so yes, they will probably have to rely on the Bloc, but it depends also what type of minority government we have. What we've seen since 2019, the last federal elections, is a strong minority government, a strong liberal minority government. At dissolution, we talk about 155 seats. I think they won 157 back in 2019, and you only need 170 seats to have majority. So the Liberals could, win these confidence votes and get things done legislatively with support of only one party at a time. What happens if we have a weaker minority government, either liberal or conservative, and they need support of at least two opposition parties to stay in power? That will become, first of all, really unstable, and also, really difficult to manage, I think, for the party in power. So the Liberals took a really huge gamble. Justin Trudeau, when he went to see the Governor General, and I said it before the elections that it was a gamble. People thought, no, they would just sail towards a majority government, or the worst thing that can happen is that they get another minority government, but a strong minority government. But now what we are seeing is that they could get, even if they return to power, have significantly fewer seats than they have now, and they had a dissolution, which was 155, and that will create instability. The Liberals, that we had a stable minority government. The minority parliament was working well. Why having elections?
I just don't see how it's possible the Liberals get as many seats as they had last time. He has not done well, and the polls are neck and neck. So how can he win 155 seats? It's got to be less, even if he's got the plurality. I guess can't see how it can be as strong. And if he needs two parties to vote with him, and if you talk about strong minorities, I remember Kathleen Wynne. She had what she called a super minority. She was one seat shy of a majority, and she was gone within, what was it, 12 months or 18 months? She was gone. So, even a super minority doesn't work.
It doesn't guarantee it. And I think we are poised to have another minority government, which means that I think Trudeau admitted it earlier during the campaign, that we might also have more federal elections in 18 months from now, maybe even earlier than that, if we have a weaker minority government. But what's, as for the Liberals, can they return with as many seats? You know, last time, don't forget, they lost popular vote in 2019. And they were still able to get way more seats than the Conservatives. I think they got like 36 or 35 or 36 seats more than the Conservatives, even if they lost the popular vote by 1 point. This is the first past the post system. We have 338 elections. If you win in a rural county, if the Conservatives win by 70% or 60% in a rural riding in Alberta, it doesn't help them winning ridings in the GTA or in rural Quebec.
I think the difference this time, sir, is going to be the power, the strength of the NDP in suburban Toronto and Vancouver.
Yes.
And our radio station, as you know, is broadcast from Mississauga. In the last election, the Conservatives did not win one seat in Mississauga, Brampton, or even Halton. And the Minister of Transportation in Milton went down to defeat. And the reason why was not because the Conservative vote went down a lot. The Conservative vote stayed pretty steady. What happened is the NDP vote collapsed, and that vote went to the Liberals, and the Liberals won all those seats. In 2011, what ended up happening is the Orange Wave increased the NDP vote at the Liberals' expense. And again, the Conservatives won almost every seat but one. And it's interesting, the Conservative vote did not go up a lot. It only went up by like a point. But what happened is the Liberal vote went down. And I think most polls would suggest that Jagmeet Singh is actually doing well. And we could have the splits in suburban Toronto in the 905 and frankly, the suburban Vancouver. I'm not sure about Montreal, but the splits work in the favor of the Conservatives such that even with 41% in those areas, they could win.
But conversely, I think it's a very good point, but conversely, the rise of the People's Party of Canada could be a source of problem for the Conservatives. And so you're absolutely right about the NDP in Southern Ontario, in parts of British Columbia. But I would say that if the People's Party is doing as well as some polls show, that could be bad news for the Conservatives. So, and if you look at seat projections right now, the Liberals are ahead, but it's true that on average, they might not be able to return to the level that they had before. And the Conservatives, of course, still have a significant chance to win. But, you know, it's really hard to make predictions. That's why I don't make predictions about elections, because we could end up also with a majority government come September 21st. And, you know, you remember 2015, who could have predicted at the beginning of the campaign that the Liberals would have a majority government?
They were in third place at the beginning of the campaign.
And look at what happened in Nova Scotia, where the Progressive Conservatives won. And before the beginning of the campaign, supposedly in the polls, they were 25 points below. I'm not saying this is what will happen at the federal level. I'm just saying that we always have to take polls with a grain of salt and always understand that this is a picture of what's happening at a certain point in time, but it's always looking in the rearview mirror. When a poll comes out, it's already outdated in a way. And the mood can change quite rapidly in some places, especially when you have three-way races, where even a small change could actually alter the race altogether.
We're chatting tonight with Professor Daniel Beland from McGill University. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having a lot of fun tonight talking with Daniel Beland. He's the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada at the Department of Political Science at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. Dr. Beland, you wrote a book that I really want to read now called How Ideas and Institutions Shape the Politics of Public Policy. I'm intrigued because coming out of the Great Recession, both Obama and McGuinty, the Premier of Ontario at the time, had budgets that had the same quote in them. They talked about how do we get goods, people, and ideas moving again. And they talked about infrastructure spending being the ways that you get goods and people moving again, highways and rapid transit, stuff like that. But the problem was, how do you get ideas moving again? How do you get innovation and entrepreneurship happening again? What do you think? How do you get ideas moving?
Well, I think that, first of all, we should not be afraid of debating things that things that we may not want normally to talk about. For example, I mentioned taxation. The how we'll pay for all the new spending. We should also be afraid to revisit some of our assumptions about the world, about how things are going, about the economy. And certainly when we talk about the role of ideas, economic ideas are especially powerful, especially important. So ideas about whether we should balance the budget or whether balancing the budget is not so important. Ideas about whether taxation is the price we pay for a civilized society, a quote I alluded to earlier, or if taxation is necessarily something bad and that we should always try to limit and even cut. And so economic ideas are really a battleground, and we need to make sure that we have an open debate about about our assumptions regarding what society we want. It's not just about what economy we want, but what society we want and how much we'll pay for it. And this is an important debate. Ideas matter, but it's also important to understand that this is an important debate, and we should make sure that we are not just letting politicians run that debate, because there are things they don't want to talk about and that we should be discussing.
So you get ideas going again through open debate, through discussion.
Yes, I think think tanks, the media, social media, we can all take part in that debate, and we should also try to make sure that we create bodies where there is this exchange of ideas, this what we call policy communities, where people can really discuss different policy alternatives, different policy solutions, a bit outside of the political mainstream, where it's always the same things that pop up and they repeat the same promises from election to election. So, for example, we are in the process of creating a commission on fiscal federalism in this country. I'm involved in this, and I think that it's important and it's not non-governmental. We are just a bunch of, academics, former civil servants, other people who get together and just try to think about issues that politicians sometimes don't really want to address. We should not let politicians be the only ones discussing our future.
Let me ask you a final question, if I could. On Thursday during the leaders' debate, I was extremely impressed with the leader of the Bloc Québécois. I would never vote for a separatist or the Bloc Québécois, obviously, but he seemed incredibly knowledgeable, very smart, and a very good policy sense for not only just Quebec but Canada. Even though he never spoke about Canada, the policies were applicable. Is having a separatist party in the national parliament a good idea? Is it in Quebec's interest? Has it been beneficial to Quebec?
That's a very good question. People in Quebec are debating this, whether it's actually good for Quebecers or not. Because as the other parties will say, especially the Liberals and the Conservatives, Quebecers are more powerful when they are at the cabinet table. That is, when they are in power, one of the two main parties, so the Conservatives or the Liberals, that having Quebecers really at the table is very important. And there are even sovereignists in Quebec who question the wisdom of having a sovereignist party in Ottawa, because people in Quebec know, and sovereignists and federalists know, that if there is, sovereignty someday, and it's not going to happen anytime soon, it's not doing well in the polls, sovereignty is not doing well right now, that sovereignty will happen in Quebec. It will be another referendum or through elections and so forth, if it ever happens. And so it won't happen in Ottawa. And having a sovereignist party in Ottawa, some people think is not useful. Actually, Lucien Bouchard, when he created the Bloc, it was meant to be a temporary party until the next referendum. The referendum occurred in 1995. and after that, of course, Mr. Bouchard became premier of Quebec. And then, of course, the Bloc has remained around, has been around ever since. But even Lucien Bouchard said later that he doesn't think that having the Bloc around for so long is a good idea, because it was meant to be a temporary program to pave the way to a referendum. There's no referendum coming up in Quebec anytime soon. And so I think federalists don't think the Bloc is a good idea, because they say you should be at at the cabinet table and being in part of the government, and the Bloc cannot ever form government. They only run seats in Quebec. That's 78. It's not enough to form government anyway. And then there are sovereignists to say, well, do we actually need this? But if François Blanchet, you're right, is very clever and he's very well spoken. He's a former Quebec cabinet minister. He was also on television and on a show in Radio-Canada called Les Ex about former politicians who discuss issues. And that's where he learned really how to deal with the media and so forth in a very eloquent way. But there is still the issue of whether the legitimacy of the Bloc is called into question. Every election, they have to face this issue. Why are we voting for this party? Especially because sovereignty is not on the agenda. Even if François Blanchet doesn't talk about sovereignty at all during the campaign, it's very rare we talk about it. It's not really in their platform. Last time around, the same thing. So it's a sovereignist party, but they don't talk about sovereignty because they know that Quebecers are not there yet, or they are not interested in sovereignty anymore, at least for now. So it's a challenge for the Bloc. But if François Blanchet is, as I said, very clever leader, and he's exploiting also like the question that was asked about Quebec at the beginning of the English language debate, and he's spinning that in a way that might be very helpful for the Bloc. So they are likely to stick around for a while and to get quite a few seats this time around.
Professor Dr. Daniel Beland from McGill University, thank you so much for joining us. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Well, 1 week from now, it's going to be election night. And so if nothing else, get out there and use your franchise and cast a vote for whatever party. Thank you all for joining us. Professor Beland, thank you very much. Let's do this again sometime.
You're most welcome. Take care.